Hello everyone and welcome back. This week we're going to be doing a deep dive here on my father's L78 out of his 70 Chevelle and try to put a game plan together for what it's going to take to get this thing back together again so that we can drop this into the crusty green Chevelle that you have seen on the channel previously. Now this engine here is the entire reason I was looking for a Chevelle in the first place. I was looking for a roller primarily, and then I found the crusty car with the seized motor in it, and I figured, okay, well, if that motor is junk, great, I've got the L78 that's going to go in it anyway. But as you saw, we got that 402 that was in the crusty car up and going again, but it is down on power, it's low compression, it leaves a lot to be desired. So this little L78 here is really going to hop that up for us. Now, I hope you like story time because there is a lot to go through with this engine here, and pretty much everything I know about it is just shrouded in stories. So, if I begin at the beginning, at least for what I knew about it, this thing sat pretty much as you see it here, disassembled in the basement my entire childhood. The bare block here was just sitting on a workbench in the basement. A lot of the components here were just kind of strung about. Like the pistons were actually assembled and they were just hanging from the floor joists on nails. There were some long tube black steel headers down there. There was the oil pan as well. On a shelf in one of the corners, there were a couple of sets of heads and a bunch of other components that went along with the car as well. There was the shifter. I wish I still had that, the Hurst shifter that he had in there. I do have the valve covers. You've already seen me take the air cleaner that I had from that collection. That's already on the crusty green car because I didn't have one when I got it. The crankshaft over here was actually sitting next to that shelf my entire childhood as well. So I have never seen this thing assembled. And I believe it was disassembled sometime in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. But my father had 5 kids by the time they were 23, 24, somewhere around there, and I was the last in 83. So yeah, he really didn't have a whole lot of spare income to go and dump on getting this thing back together again. So everything here just basically sat where it was up until after he died. He was killed in a work accident in 2000. Then my brother took the motor, held onto it for a little bit, and then I picked it up from him. I was going to put it in my 57 Chevy, but I decided this thing just needs to go back in a Chevelle, and that's where I went Chevelle hunting. So lots of stories to go through with this thing here once we start getting into it. So let's start taking a closer look at this block here. So the best place to begin is just going to be right here on our passenger side at the front of the block here, just in front of where the head would usually end. And that's where they're going to have all of the stampings for the engine serial number. It's a 3-digit code there as well as the partial VIN. So we can see here that this one is a CKO. You can barely make out the K there, it's pretty light stamping. But that does correctly identify this as a 70 L78 for a 4-speed car. I think there's a couple of other things that are unique to the L78s. Like I think these little valve reliefs here are only cut on the L78. I don't think those are on the other 396 or 402 blocks. This is a 4-bolt main, which is correct for the L78. I'll show you the caps here a little bit later. If we come to this side, it does have the large hole here at the front, which is usually indicative of the 4 bolts. And then this one here I think was always the same size. I think that's 3/4, and I think this one here is a 1/2 inch. I think it was a 1/4 inch on the 2 bolts, and those are usually plugged up. I think they were meant to be for oil coolers, but I don't think any of the cars actually had them. And then the rear one here is for the actual Z-bar. If we look at the casting number back here, it is a 3969854, which is going to be correct for a 69 to 72 396 or 402 block. If we spin it just a little bit more here, try to get the light in here so we can actually see. But we've got our date code right there, which is going to be H20 and then 9 for the year over there. So that's going to be August 20th of 69, which sounds correct for a 70. Now this is where things get pretty interesting here, and if you have eagle eyes and are very familiar with these stampings, you may have realized a problem already. So if we come back here, we start looking at that partial VIN. I'll read it out to you, but it is a 10W124633. And so, yeah, I got to looking that up and was very, very confused. So W there, that stands for the build plant of where the car was built. And I believe the W is for Willow Springs. And there were no Chevelles built there. It was only Novas. So this partial VIN here appears to be from a Nova and not a Chevelle. So that was really confusing, and I didn't really quite understand all of that. Now, I think that is the case. If I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me, but it sent me on a path of trying to chase down what the heck is the story with this engine. So I went to my mother first, and she didn't know a whole lot. She didn't really know why it would have been replaced, but she told me that the engine was rebuilt. And so the whole story of my father's Chevelle was, at least that I knew of, was that he had this nice 70 Chevelle, and he had wrecked it going through town at a high rate of speed, and that was the end of the Chevelle. He pulled the motor out here, and it just kind of sat after that, and he did nothing else with it. So I just always assumed that the Chevelle was wrecked and that this was the motor from it. But when I was talking to her, she said that the motor was rebuilt, and that it was rebuilt not long before he actually wrecked the car. So that got me thinking and wondering, so I started chasing the rabbit a little bit further here, and I had to kind of expand the scope here, trying to go to any of his friends or any of the people he grew up with that would have known him at that time. And it's a pretty small list here since my dad's not around, obviously, since he died. So I tried tracking down some of his friends, like one of his good friends that he probably would have known is no longer with us as well. So then I went with my cousin, who pretty much grew up like my father's brother. So I went to him, and he kind of knew a little bit about it. He had said that the engine blew up maybe about 2 weeks before that he wrecked it, somewhere around there. And as far as that story went, he just told me that he was running through town with another one of his friends, blew the motor up somehow, probably doing something stupid, and then they pulled that all apart. He thought they just rebuilt the motor and slapped it back in, so he was confused as to why it's showing up as a Nova motor as well. So then I had to go to the other friend, try to track them down. This is someone I've never met in my life. Message them on Facebook, and I'm like, hey, do you remember my father and driving around with him like some probably 45 years ago and blowing up the motor in his car? And sure enough, he remembered the story, and he told me that, yeah, he grenaded it pretty good. So I'm thinking what happened was that he killed that block, just destroyed that block. The story was that he was doing somewhere around 130 miles per hour and the block let go. So at those speeds, I'm assuming the damage would have probably taken out the block. And so everyone after that just thought that he had the engine rebuilt either at Sears or Montgomery Ward's. And nobody really knew which one. They kind of fought back and forth. But my thinking is that he went there, just turned in his dead, exploded, whatever was left from his motor, and picked this one up as just a rebuilt core. And that would kind of make sense with what I've found digging through this thing. So it seems like he just basically brought his core in and just swapped it out for pretty much just a rotating short block. And so yeah, it was pretty fun just trying to chase this story around, chasing down people's memories of events that happened, like I said, 45 years ago, to try to figure out the story of where this block came from, since it doesn't appear to be a Chevelle block. But yeah, everything kind of jives with that. So if we look at these cylinders here, they're extremely clean. Now they got a little bit of markings in there, and that's just kind of some scratches and the surface rust, but the bores are really, really clean on these things. Just really, really nice on it. You can see there's a lot of rust that has just accumulated from it sitting as long as it has, but other than that, it is very clean through here. There's like no ring ridge of any kind anywhere in the motor. The lifter pockets are all really nice as well. So it definitely does seem like, okay, yeah, maybe this was rebuilt, only spent about a week actually running, and then was torn back apart again because it was pulled out of the car. So yeah, that all definitely jives. So what I want to do next is figure out what the bore is on these, since they were rebuilt. Now I do have the pistons for this, and that's these here. And you can tell that these are not a very tall dome. That is a very small little dome on those things, so I don't believe these would have been correct L78 style replacements. There is a .04 marked there on the top, so that tells me that they're probably 40 over. But again, this thing being a 396/402, you never know if that's 40 over based on the 396 bore, which should mean that would be like a 4.135, or if that's 40 over on the 402 bore, which is a 4125, meaning that this would be a 4165. So yeah, a lot of numbers there I just threw at you, but kind of got to figure out what these things are here. So they don't really have a whole lot of information on them other than a B that you can kind of see there. Hopefully the camera picks that up. And then over here on the other side, they are marked, looks like 573L. It's got a B-573L. So I believe these are just like period correct Badger pistons. I think Badger was the company that made them. And they are differentiated left to right there. But I couldn't find much information Googling that part code up other than that they were just Badger generic replacements. Like I couldn't figure out what this dome size is here to figure out what compression would have been with these. But it does look a heck of a lot smaller than the L78 replacements. So I want to go ahead and measure out the bore on these things, try to figure out what this thing is actually at, and then that's going to let me figure out the game plan of how to move forward with this. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bore gauge all set up and walk you through how I'm going to check the bore on this. So there's a number of different tools you can use for measuring your bore. You can kind of get a ballpark quickly here with just a regular dial caliper. You just kind of come over to the bore, open it up, drop it down in there so you're measuring the inside diameter. Kind of get it close, and then pull it back out. And that gives us a reading of 4.160-ish. So yeah, that's leading me to believe that that 40 over there on that piston is probably based off the 402 size. So that's good handy information to know, but it's not perfect. I'm going to set it back there and just kind of lock it in for right now, because I'm going to reference that again here in a second. Now there's limits to what that'll give you, because if you have a ring ridge here at the top, it's just going to measure that ring ridge. It's not going to really get down in there. And if your bores are kind of out around, like they're egg-shaped or anything like that, you're not going to know because there's not enough depth. So then they make these other gauges like these kind of T-style ones here. And for these, they've kind of got this little set screw at the bottom. You open that up, and then the arms expand. And so then you can just kind of come through here, push those little arms in, get it in your bore, kind of get it to where it's maximum size there, and then just tighten up the set screw. And I've messed it up a little bit. There we go. And then you can just pull that back out, and then you can measure this with your dial caliper. Now this is pretty close. It's also kind of useful for measuring if things are kind of out around, but it's not the best either. At least these ones here aren't, because the ends are pretty flat. And so when it's in there, it's kind of not measuring the full width necessarily, because the ends are kind of hitting instead of going right off the widest point. So it gets you pretty close, but not entirely all the way there. So that's why I'm going to end up using this other tool that I got from Amazon. So this is just a digital dial bore gauge, and this one's a lot more easy to use. It's got a tiny little pin there, so it's better at reading actual cylinders instead of that kind of big flatter surface there. It's got little wheels on it, so it slides nice and easy up and down the bore. So once I get that set up to the right size, I can kind of move that down the bore and just continue measuring really nice and easily. Now it's a little bit of a chore to set this all up here, so I'm going to go ahead and put the camera down here, kind of walk you through this thing. So to use our fancy little gauge here, we've got to do a little bit of setup work first. We've got to get this overall length down here to about the same size as our bore, because it reads off this tiny little dimple here in the back, which only has a range of about 100 thousandths. So we got to get it in the ballpark of the bore first, and then we use our dial caliper afterwards and then kind of confirm the actual bore measurements. So that's why I locked this in earlier here at the 4160, and that's approximately what I need to get this thing to now, is to about this length here. So to do that, we can take off the little cap here at the end, and then they have different lengths of rod that you can install here. Now, if you need something really big that's larger than their largest rod, which this is the largest rod they offer, as you can see, that's not going to make up that distance we need. It comes pretty close, but not quite. So they come with this little threaded on extender here. That's what we're going to be putting in next. So put that in here. And then we'll put on our little original tiny one and see where that about gets us. And you can see we're getting closer. So once we're on the balls, we're like right there, but not quite. So I'm going to go ahead and put one of the shims in. So it comes with shims that let you shim it out from about 0.5 millimeter, I think, all the way up to 3 millimeter. So I'm going to put one of the shims in there, probably about the 1 millimeter shim, I think. Try to get a little bit of space, and then we'll go and try that in the actual bore. So there's that little shim I was talking about. It's just like a washer that slides onto that little rod. Then you just slide that down into the hole. Then you just thread your cap back on. And that there should make our overall length where it'll fit down in that bore. It'll be a little bit bigger than the bore, and then that'll push that little dimple in the back there in, and then that'll let us read. And then we can zero it out to what the bore is. And then we can use that to get our base measurement off our dial caliper to tell what the actual bore size is, and then we can kind of move it up and down the bore to figure out if it's in zero or not. Because the more we go up and down the bore, if our gauge here is dancing around and moving off of the zero, once we do that, that's going to tell us that it's getting either wider or tighter at the bottom. So that's how we're going to do that, and that's how we'll figure out exactly the shape of these bores. So with my tools all set up, I should be all set to go ahead and measure one of these bores. So I've got the gauge here all ready to go. It fits inside the bore there. I've just zeroed it out at its maximum size here. So I'm going to go ahead and get it installed in the bore. And it's going to be a little bit hard to read this from the camera, but essentially you want to get it in there, make sure everything is nice and centered, and then kind of read your gauge and kind of slide it up and down and then side to side and get it to where it's at the most balanced value. And it takes a little bit of practice here, but once you start doing it, it becomes a bit intuitive here. So once you got that figured out, then you're going to want to come back in here and zero it out. Once you think you got it all dialed in, you zero it out, and then from there you can kind of move it down the gauge or down the bore a little bit further, maybe about halfway down. Measure it again, and you want to see is that your gauge just stays at a nice 0-0 there. And you've got it back to neutral. And that's going to let you confirm that the bore is just nice and even all the way down. I'm going to go down about 1 inch from the bottom here, measure down there as well. And everything is looking really good so far. It is looking really nice. So we'll pull that back out of there, and then we're going to go ahead and turn the gauge and measure across the bore. Get that started in there as well. This one's a little bit harder for me to see. But that's looking correct. Slide it down about halfway down there. Yep, going back right to 0. Not going any higher than that, so it's not getting any larger than that bore size, so that's good. Go down towards the bottom again, and the same thing. So as expected, our bore on this cylinder here is really nice and true. go ahead and measure up this one here right quick. See if I can get that one measuring equal. Yep, that's looking really good there at the top. Go about halfway down. Really good there as well. All the way down near the bottom. Really true there as well. Come across. Do it as well. Yeah, so everything is checking out really good on this. So all of our bores here seem to be true. And I'll go back and check all the rest as well, just to confirm that every single hole here is good. So once you pull this back out of the hole here, since you zeroed it out, it's going to tell you the difference of this total size when it's at fully open here and from where you zeroed it at. So we zeroed it at 36 thousandths less than this total open size. So now to figure out my actual bore, I can measure this total open size with my dial caliper there and then just subtract the 36 thousandths from that, and that'll then tell me what my zero is. And that'll tell me what these bore sizes are. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right quick, since it's probably going to take a bit of coordination here, since I got to try to get this lined up with those tiny little dimples on there. It's not the easiest thing in the world, so we'll see what we get. So I measured off the digital gauge there, and we're coming out at 4165. So that's going to match up with what we read earlier off our piston here, the 0.04. So that's going to be 40 thousandths bigger than the 402 size. So that's what these were based off of. So that's going to really limit us in terms of piston choice out there. I mean, that means the block is 70 thousandths over 396 size already. And I've done a little bit of research on this, and I found that most of the pistons out there are either 30 over 396, which is what a 402 from the factory is, or they're 30 thousandths more than that. So they figure if you have a 396, bore it out to 30 over if you need to clean everything up. If you have a 402, bore it 30 over to 4155 if you need to clean it up. And that's really all you can find in terms of off-the-shelf, at least popular choices. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of dome on this. I think the L78s had like a 37 or 38 cc dome. This seems to be quite a bit less. I can't really find any information on it to figure out what this is. I mean, technically we could reuse these pistons, but again, I can't find much information on them to really know. They're just kind of a generic cast, kind of old school replacement, so we might be able to do a little bit better. There are a few choices, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So again, the block here is 70 thousandths over. I went through and cleaned up some of the bores here with the Scotch-Brite, and everything's looking really nice and good on them. There's no pitting, no scoring, no nothing. I think with just a light hone job, these bores will be good to go. So I think our block here really won't need any machine work. I'm probably going to drop it off tomorrow at the machinist, have them just kind of tank it, do a little light bore hone on it to clean up the lifter bores for me as well. Probably have them put the freeze plugs in, stuff like that, but I don't think we need to do anything as far as overboring this or anything like that. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at our crank here and our heads and try to get a game plan together based on what we find there. So coming over here to our crankshaft, you can see we got the casting number there. I think that's 6223, and that should be the correct forged crankshaft for the L78. It's got the 376 stroke on it and does not look to be in the best of condition here. Some of these journals look a little sad. So yeah, I don't know if that's going to clean up with just a buff job. They may have to grind that down. So I'm going to keep that in mind as well, since I've kind of got a plan shaping in the back of my head with what we've been finding here. So let's go ahead and jump over to the heads. All right, so let's check out some of the other goodies we got here. So we got all of the original hardware here all nicely bagged up. Got all the galley plugs, even the Z-bar stud there, everything else in the bags. Got a couple of different connecting rods here. I don't think these are the original L78s. They're not dimpled. Some of them look like they've kind of been machined, maybe for balancing, stuff like that. The tops there are cut off a little bit on some of them. And then a couple of these others here do have numbers. I don't know if these go by numbers or if you just usually check the bolt diameters for these big blocks. But this one says 6241, and then it says 140 on the other side. And it says GM and 140 down here in the corners. So here is slightly different. It says 3175. And on the back side has 76 at the top, and GM and 76 again. And these are press fit, so I'll probably just end up ditching those, get some nice floaters in there so it's just easier to assemble. Go with some decent aftermarket H-beams, not too unreasonably priced. Down beneath here, we've just got a bunch of other random oddball ends and stuff like that. We've got the pins, the caps for all the rods. Got the mains there. You can see they're all 4-bolt. They all look really nice. Over here we've got all the remaining pistons, which all look really nice as well. Technically we could probably reuse these things. I don't know that dome size though, and they're just generic kind of cast aluminum, but we probably just throw a ring pack in there and run with them if need be. However, we get to these heads, and now we got to go back to story time here. So I got all of the hardware for these heads, stuff like that, but these are not L78 heads. So the story goes that my father had a 87 Silverado. It had a 396 transplanted in it from a 71 Chevelle. And he didn't like the low compression, so he took the heads that he had, presumably off of this motor here, and swapped them into that pickup truck, and then these are the heads off of that truck. So these are H24s of 70, and it looks like they're 820 castings. And the 820 casting is really not a bad casting. It's kind of halfway between open and closed chamber. I think they're around like 113 cc. Not too bad. But the heads that he ended up replacing these with, they were not rectangle port either. So I don't think that this thing, after he got it back, ever had a rectangle port heads on it. And that would make sense with these pistons since they don't seem really domed. So I think the L78 pistons, again, are supposed to be like a 37, 38 cc dome, something like that. And then they'd be paired up with those rectangle port heads that were around like 107 cc, somewhere around there. And yeah, I don't see that working very well or all that particularly great with these kind of pistons here. He'd have been losing out on some compression there. And with some flat tops paired with these 813s, I think that's what he ended up replacing these things for, was he wanted the compression bump. So I ended up owning that pickup truck a few years after he had sold it to a friend of the family. Then he had died, and then I bought it back like a year or two after that and owned it for a number of years, and then finally ended up selling it. But when I was going through it, it used to frustrate me that it had two different heads on it. One was like a big spark plug, and the other one was a smaller spark plug. And so when I was going through it the one day, I found out that one head was a 290 and the other head was like a 063, something like that. But they were both oval port closed chamber heads. And that makes a whole lot more sense for what I've found in this engine thus far. So it's kind of these little flat toppers, small little dome, stuff like that. He was probably running just the closed chamber ovals on this thing, getting that compression up to something reasonable. And that's why he took those off. Or I took those heads and put them on the truck, replacing these 813s to get a little bit of a compression bump. So again, if we were to use these with these 820s, we'd probably have some terrible compression as well. Since I'm thinking these are probably somewhere around like 20 cc, something like that. I think we'd only have like 9-to-1, somewhere around there. Not really what I'm after. So again, this all kind of goes back to this piston size here. Finding out that this is 4165 is a little bit of a bummer because it really narrows my choices. But I'd kind of planned for this a little bit. I'd been looking around, kind of reading about these engines a little bit recently, and when I started seeing that there was really limited piston choices in these larger bores here, and I really didn't know what the bore was, I started looking at what kind of choices you'd run into if that was the case. And so these pistons here are the 4165s. There's really only two off-the-shelf affordable pistons in this size that you can find, and they are both made by Keith Black. They're both basically identical pistons, almost to this thing here. They are 17 cc dome. I think this might be a little bit more than that. Not entirely sure. So these heads here would just be out of the question. We wouldn't have enough compression with these. We'd be down in the 8s, something like that, maybe low 9s, somewhere around that range. So those aren't going to work for us. But what was interesting that I found is that the two pistons that they make in this style with that kind of dome, one of them is just kind of drop right in for your regular build here. Just kind of build in your normal 402, whatever this would be, like 405, 406, maybe even a 409 with the bore at 4165. I'm not really good with the cubic inch math here, but excuse me. What I found was that the other set, for the exact same price, same exact piston, the difference is it is set up for a 4-inch stroke. So what we can do here is, because we're going to have to spend some money on that bad boy over there, getting that thing cleaned up, everything else, we can just set that boy aside, forget it even exists, go out and get us a 454 crank, drop that bad boy in here, run a 4-inch stroke, get those Keith Black pistons here, which are going to basically be the exact same as the other ones, a little 17cc dome, but they're designed for that 4-inch stroke. Run original style connecting rods there, so we don't have to do anything fancy with the connecting rod, and suddenly we have a 435 on our hands instead of a 409. So we can pick up a couple of cubes by putting a stroker in this thing, running essentially the same exact kind of piston we'd have either way, and it'd probably be cheaper than trying to go through and have that thing cleaned up and everything else. You can get some decent aftermarket cast cranks for pretty affordable prices. I even saw a forged 454 one local to me that I might go check out as well. So we will need to do something about the heads in this situation, pretty much no matter what though, because of our limited choice in piston. We're going to have to find us some closed chamber ovals. Now I could go back to rectangle port, but for this size block, even though we're bumping the cubes up, I don't know that we really need the rectangles. I feel like you really want the 454s, 496s, stuff like that to make use of those rectangles. I think the ovals are just a little bit better for that kind of street motor in the cubes that we're going to have here. So I want to stay with oval. We're going to stick with oval ports. We're going to try to find us some 290s. Hopefully find us a pair that matches. I don't want to go back to having mismatched plugs again. I think there's like 3 sets of heads that'll work for us. It's going to be the 290s, the 063, and I think the 215s. I think those are all relatively exactly the same other than like the spark plug, stuff like that. But those are going to be 101cc. Paired up with that Keith Black piston. It's very similar to this one here in this exact bore size. They make a number of them. They're off the shelf, easy to get a hold of. We'll be able to just drop that thing in here, get this thing up to 435 cubes, and have about 10.2 to 1 compression, which is exactly what I'm looking for. It should work out perfectly for us on the street. Those oval port heads will work out really nice. So I don't think any of this hardware down here is really going to be of any use to us. It's got guide plates. They look a little bit beat up. It's got these stainless valves, but they're not really undercut or anything like that. And I think they're 206 and 176. I mean, technically the L78 would have had the 219 valves, but I'm not convinced that we really even need 219s for this, for what we're doing, even with the more cubes. Stuff like that. Again, I think we'll be okay with just a regular set of 290s, 215, something like that. That'll have that 101 chamber. It'll get us right around, I think, about 10.2 to 1 compression, which should be perfect for the street for this thing. So, I mean, I've got springs and stuff like that, retainers, everything else down there, but I can't find numbers on any of it, so I'm not really sure what any of it is. It's all pretty dated, so just going to go ahead and replace on all of that. In terms of cam in here, I'd been thinking about going with the ZZ502 cam, which is a roller lifter setup. And I'll probably do retrofit hydraulic lifters in this thing. And what's nice is it's already pre-drilled for the cam plate up front here, so I can just drop all that stuff in, not really have to do any kind of work for that. But we might even get a little bit more aggressive than the ZZ502 since we're adding a few more cubes now. With that 435, we might go just a little bit more aggressive on this. and maybe get a little bit more horsepower out of it. But we don't want to really sacrifice or give up too much on our low end. So I've kind of got a game plan together here. Kind of got some ideas now that I've gone through everything, figured out what we've got here. Gonna have to hit the market, try to find some heads. Gonna get this thing to the machine shop, have them clean it up, have them hone it out really nicely for us. Probably get all of the plugs back in it, everything else. Maybe even get it painted up as well. Gonna go and scour the net, try to find us a 454 crank, get us some connecting rods, start ordering up all the lifters, the cam, all of that stuff here once I get the green light on the block. And I'm pretty certain we are gonna go with that stroked build for that 435 on this thing. So yeah, once we get that green light, I'm just gonna go ahead and order up a bunch of that stuff, and that's gonna probably take a little bit. So that's probably gonna do it this week for the video here. Again, a bit under the weather, so not a whole lot of content here. Hopefully I'll be feeling better. And once parts start coming in and we start getting this thing slapped together, I'll have a whole lot more interesting stuff for you. So once again, thank you all so much for watching.